of those present were saying indignantly to one another, "Why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wage and the money given to the poor," and they rebuked her harshly. "Leave her alone," said Jesus. "Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them any time you want, but you will not always have me. She did what she could. She poured the perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her." Then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray Jesus to them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. You may be seated.
Have you ever heard of a sandwich story in the Bible? Probably not, or not characterized in that terms, but you've probably heard them. I'm going to tell you one, not the one I'm going to speak about today, but one that'll give you kind of an orientation. Remember earlier in the Gospel of Mark, Jesus is out, and a ruler of a synagogue approaches him and says, "My little girl's dying. Come and touch her and heal her." And Jesus says, "Okay." So they're on their way, and then all of a sudden, Mark switches to another story as they're on their way, and there's a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years. And she spent all of her money, and the physicians haven't done her any good. And she hears about Jesus, and she thinks, well, if I can just go and touch his garment, then I'll be healed. And sure enough, she secretly goes up there and touches him, and she's healed. And he, of course, feels it and says, "Who touched me?" And so he talks with her and tells her her faith has saved her, and she goes her way. And then we go back to the story with the synagogue ruler, and they're still on their way. And they say, well, she's died. And Jesus says, well, just believe, and everything will be okay. And so he takes Peter, James, and John up into the room and touches her, and she's raised from the dead. And they give her something to eat. And so that's a sandwich story. You've got the outer story and then the inner story. Now, don't think that, the in-between part is the most important part, because you can't have a sandwich without the bread. They're holding it together. And if you go to Philadelphia and have a Philly cheesesteak sandwich, they will tell you the bread makes the sandwich. But you see, those two are it's done this way to tell you a complete story. Now, the reason why we probably haven't spoken about that too much is that scholars are kind of discovering that the Bible was written in its original form in order to be read out loud to people. Because you see, back then, nobody had their own personal Bibles. We're very fortunate. We get to take our Bibles home with us. We get to read them anytime we want. And in fact, we can take them with us. And now we've got them on our iPhones and our iPads and our Androids and so forth, and we can whip them out at work and show people stuff in the Bible. But up until the 1400s, when the scripture, as the scripture was being written and then completed, nobody had their own personal Bibles, and they had to come to church and hear it read, and so it had to be structured in such a way that people could understand it. Some of the Psalms are written in what they call an acrostic style, which means alphabetical. Starts with their first letter, and each line has a letter of the alphabet, and they can remember it easier. And so that's why then we've noticed then these things called sandwich stories in the Gospels in particular. And the passage that Sean read for us in Mark 14 is a sandwich story. Now, most likely, and I've done this too, we preachers focus upon that middle part there. And we tell you all about that alabaster vial of perfume. But Mark wants us to see the outer part first as well. And so let's see what Mark has to say to us, starting in chapter 14, beginning of verse 1. He tells us, first of all, the Passover and unleavened bread is a couple of days away, and the chief priests and the scribe were seeking how they might seize him to kill him. Now you'll notice that he doesn't mention the Pharisees here. The Pharisees actually, after their little scuffle with Jesus in the final week, where they get together with the Herodians, which is kind of an interesting story in and of itself when you think about it, and they ask, should we pay taxes to Caesar? They kind of disappear out of the picture. And it's the chief priests and the scribes who actually kind of get together and start this plot in order to kill Jesus. Here they are, they don't know that it's Jesus' final week as we know it, because we're on this side of the cross as we look at it. But they're seeing now, I mean, they've been hearing for 3 years all the things going on in Galilee and down throughout Judea. And now here he is in this final week, it's Passover, and he seems to be more popular than ever, and they're worried, of course, that they're going to lose their position. Now, the chief priests, while the Bible doesn't really tell us this, we know historically, they collude with the Romans. They like being in power, and so they and the Romans make sure that the right high priest is chosen every year, because they're the rich, they're the aristocracy, they're the ones with the power and the money, and they want to keep in power. And so they're worried that Jesus' popularity is going to destroy them, take away their power. The Romans will come in, and who knows what might happen. And so they got to take care of him, and so they're trying to figure out how to seize him. Now, Mark wants us, of course, to keep in mind the fact that this is during the Passover. We know that the Passover is a perfect picture of Jesus, because back in Egypt, here they are in slavery, and with a mighty hand, at that final plague, they sacrifice the lamb and they sprinkle it over their door, and God passes them over and kills the firstborn of all of Egypt, and they get then to be set free. What a perfect picture of Jesus, because when God sees his blood, the blood of the lamb on our souls, then we're passed over for judgment. So Mark wants us to keep that in mind. And so here are the chief priests, they're plotting. And you can kind of see them, kind of huddled. And probably every now and then they're getting together because they're listening to Jesus and they're hearing what's going on and they're wondering what's going to happen. And so whenever they see each other, they huddle together. What can we do? What can we do? And they're probably putting the word out. Anybody that, can help us get rid of this guy. And there's somebody, of course, that we'll mention here in just a minute that hears about that. So Mark says that they're waiting for a way to seize him and kill him. I mean, they've already got in mind, we want this guy gone. We're not going to throw him in prison. We're not going to try to just keep him quiet. We want him dead and gone. And that, of course, Mark helps us to see that that's how the Passover lamb gets sacrificed, is by the very ones who think that they're going to silence him forever. And of course, they say not during the festival, otherwise there might be a riot, because they recognize his popularity. So here is the first part. Here's the first piece of bread that goes on our sandwich story. Now we switch over, and Jesus is in Bethany. It's just a little bit outside of Jerusalem. And he's at the home of Simon the leper. Now, Matthew tells us that. Luke doesn't have this story, Luke doesn't have this story, but John does in the Gospel of John. And John adds some details that we don't know about this. They're actually at the home of Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. So it's possible that Simon the leper is their father. Now remember, though, in the Bible, leprosy isn't the leprosy that we see today. What we see is called Hansen's disease. And it is a very, very bad form of leprosy. But leprosy really covered all kinds of skin diseases. I had my best friend preaching up in New Jersey, Bob Weber. He had psoriasis, and it would break out every now and then. And that probably would be covered under leprosy. Any kind of skin eruptions and so forth. But still, whatever it was, generally that individual is kind of pushed to the outside. That's just the way God set it up. God wasn't trying to say anything eternal about them. He was just trying to make a point that sin has disrupted our entire world here. And God is trying to help us to learn something about that. But that's another story. So we are at the home of Simon the leper. Mark doesn't give us all of the details. John does. But Mark doesn't. He wants to keep it simple. They're in Bethany. That's one of the places where Jesus would sometimes go during this final week and spend the night and then come back in the morning. It's just maybe a short mile or so away from there. And Mark tells us that a woman comes. Now, why he doesn't mention her, I don't know. Maybe it's because he doesn't mention Mary, Martha, and Lazarus. But John does. But he just tells us this woman comes. She's nameless in this particular story. But while they're sitting there eating, she comes and she breaks a very costly perfume of pure nard and broke the vial and poured it over his head. Now, it's possible that this was perfume that was made in India and was imported there. And it's in a sealed bottle. It's not in one of these, where you sort of, today, ladies have a bottle where they can take a little top off and they can dab it on their, on their necks and the perfume comes out. And this wasn't one of what they used it for back then. Some think that it might have been an emergency. They're probably not one of a rich family, and so they would have some money set aside in order to cover them. And what they would do is put it in the form of an investment, a vial of costly perfume. Now, today, if you've ever followed Dave Ramsey says you ought to have 6 months of emergency fund in case you lose a job or something happens. Well, that's probably what they were doing, was they had this emergency fund tied up in this perfume. It might have been an heirloom. It might have been in the family. Somebody might have bought it some years ago, and it's just been sitting there on the shelf. But it was sealed. It wasn't something that you used each and every day. And so that's why she breaks the bottle, because she has to open up the seal. She pours it over his head. Boy, that must be a scene. I've often said that I really hope that when we get past judgment, that whatever's going on there, that we've got a video room, because I want to see all of the scenes of the Bible. I want to see what everybody did. And this is a good one. Here she breaks this bottle. They're all sitting around the table. Now, first of all, let me remind you, too, back then, women did not eat with the men in a place like this. So she's intruded into male territory. She's gone in the man cave. And everybody's probably looking up and saying, what is she doing here? Now, we know, of course, from the Gospel of Luke that Mary's kind of that mindset, because she's sitting at the feet of Jesus when he comes for a meal in the Gospel of Luke. But so she breaks into male territory. They're just sitting around and they're probably wondering, what is she doing here? And then all of a sudden she pulls out this very costly vial and breaks it. And immediately the whole room fills with this fragrance. And she walks over and she pours it over Jesus' head. What a scene that must have been. And immediately somebody says, hey, wait a second, what are you doing? This is expensive stuff. Now, Sean's translation said it's a year's wages. In the original, it says 300 denarii. Now, of course, we know that a denarius was about a day's wage for the average individual. And 300 probably, actually, is a little bit more, considering that they didn't work on the Sabbath, and there were some feast days where they didn't work. So this is a little bit more than a year's wage. Now, stop and think about that. How many things in your home do you own that is worth a year of your wages? Or back when those of you who are retiring, when you were working, did you have something that just sat on the shelf that was worth a year of your wages? That's a lot of money, an awful lot of money. And she does the unthinkable. She breaks it. Now, why did they say this could have been given to the poor? Why are they thinking about that? Well, during the Passover in their days, that was one of their traditions, is that they would go out and help the poor during the Feast of Unleavened Bread. That was just something that they did. It's not something that God required during the Passover in the instructions in the book of Exodus and Deuteronomy, but it's something that they did. Now, God did tell them to be concerned about the poor. God told the farmers that when you go through and harvest, you can only go through one time. You can't go back through and pick up all the stuff that you left. That's for the poor. And you also can't harvest out to the very edge and corners of your field. You have to leave a little bit all around there in order for the poor to come and be taken care of. I didn't realize this, and I'm sure that there are some other places. I just happened to hear when I was speaking about this one time, somebody told me that in Florida there are a lot of farms that actually kind of advertise. We don't go all the way to the edge. And they actually let people who need some help come and pick and not be charged for it. So there are still some farmers today who do that. And this is a way of helping the poor. But for some reason or other, they got this idea to make it a tradition that during the Passover, you kind of help the poor. And that might have been related to the fact that when the Israelites were coming out of Egypt, they were all poor. And what did the Egyptians do? Well, they went to their Egyptian neighbors and said, hey, can you give us a little something to help us on our journey? And boy, they took off their necklaces, their earrings, and gave them as much gold and silver as they could. Yes, get out of our town now. And here's how we do it. So maybe they were sort of thinking of that. But nonetheless, they were indignant about it. Now, we know from the Gospel of John that Judas was the one that probably put this idea in them. Mark doesn't tell us that, but we do know from John. Because he was a thief and he used to steal from the money bag. So he wanted more money put in there so that he could steal from it. But back to Mark's story, though. So Jesus, as he was listening to this, says, let her alone. Why bother her? She has done a good deed to me. So here are the disciples thinking that she's wasting her valuable perfume on Jesus. Now, I'm pretty sure that's not something I want to tell the Lord, oh yeah, I thought that she was wasting this stuff on you. Jesus says, she did a good deed for me. For the poor you always have with you, and whenever you wish, you can do good to them. But me you do not always have. She has done what she could. She has anointed me, or my body beforehand, for burial. So how is it that this unnamed woman, who's intruded on male space, knows more about what's happening than those guys sitting there who've been with him for 3 years? In fact, when Peter confesses that Jesus is the Messiah, both in Matthew and in Mark, that's when Jesus begins to teach that I'm going to Jerusalem to be, and there I'm going to be beaten and scourged and crucified and buried and then risen again. And they didn't get it. In fact, Peter says, oh no, that's not going to happen. So they're clueless. And yet here is this woman who comes in and she's showing them by her very actions that she gets what's about to happen. And these guys don't. And they think she's wasted what she's got. And then he says, truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is preached in the whole world, what this woman has done will be spoken of in memory of her. And we've got it in Matthew, Mark, and John. And so the Gospels recorded that, and literally now when we preach the Gospels, we can tell them all about what's happened here with this woman. Now back to the other piece of bread that makes this sandwich story. Then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12. Mark wants us to see that, yeah, one of the 12 has heard about what the scribes and the chief priests are doing. And it says that he went off to the chief priests in order to betray him to them. They were glad when they heard this and promised to give him money. And he began to seek how to betray Jesus at an opportune time. How did Judas hear about this? Does he have spies out? I've often wondered when John tells us that Judas is a thief and he takes money out of the bag, what does he do with it? Does he give it to somebody? How does he go? How does he, does he spend it? Does he put it aside someplace? What's going on with him? But here he is. He knows that they want him, and so he goes and he says, "I'll betray him." And they promise to give him money. Now, Mark doesn't tell us. Matthew does. 30 pieces of silver. So here is Mark telling us. We've got the chief priests and the scribes. They want to kill Jesus. Here's a woman who recognizes what's going on, and she anoints him for burial with a very costly vial of perfume that now is no longer hers. She doesn't have it. She's given that money away. She's sacrificed that whole thing. It no longer sits on the shelf. She can no longer show it to her friends. When they come over and say, hey, show us that, that expensive vial of perfume. Or she could tell her family, we no longer have our emergency fund. But I did it for him. And then Judas, of course, seeing all of this, he goes off and he plots with the scribes and the chief priests. It's easy to say scribes and Pharisees, but it's the chief priests and the scribes. And he goes off, and so that's what's holding together. So you have you have the chief priests, the scribes, and Judas seeking to betray Jesus and to silence him. Now, Judas doesn't know that they want to kill him. At least that's kind of the impression we get from Matthew. Mark doesn't tell us that. But in between, though, there's a woman who understands what's going on, and she's willing to sacrifice something very costly in order to show her devotion to Jesus. Have you ever stopped and think about comparing what this woman did with this expensive vial versus Judas and what he got? He got 30 pieces of silver. That's worth about 120 denarii. And she gave away 300 denarii. Now, she sacrificed it. It's no longer available to her. She gave it for Jesus. Judas, though, wants to put the money in his pockets. He wanted to gain from Jesus. We have a lot of people in the world who want to gain from Jesus. And they have the houses and the jets and so forth to show you that they've gained from it. I remember before I was preaching, there was a lady in a congregation that I knew about who, in her business, she needed contacts. And the more contacts she had, the better off she did, of course. And somebody told me that she shows up here every now and then she disappears. And it turned out she was going to other churches. And the only thing she was really interested in was contacts. So Jesus for her was a way to get contacts. She wanted to gain off him. She really wasn't interested in his death, burial, and resurrection. She wasn't really interested in showing her devotion. She was interested in what church people could give to her. Judas wasn't interested in Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. He was interested in what he could get into his own pockets. But this unnamed woman, she's more interested in Jesus and showing him, I love you, I care about you. So she sacrificed a lot. Now, the other disciples, when they joined in and said, yeah, this could have been sold and given to the poor, they're doing what today some people call virtue signaling. They're saying, oh, yeah, we're concerned about the poor. We're really good, aren't we? And we complain in order to do it and don't really realize what's going on. Actually, the disciples seem rather clueless throughout the Gospels. Wouldn't you agree with that? And here they are together. Jesus has taught them several times, I'm going to Jerusalem to die and be raised again. No, we're not getting that. And in fact, they're arguing along the way of who's the greatest. And here's this woman showing them all up. And of course, Judas is trying to gain. So we might ask, what is Jesus worth to us? And do we really recognize? I saw I got a notice through YouTube that here's a video you might like. And so I clicked on it. I don't do that a whole lot, but I do it sometimes. And there was this guy, he loved to go to auctions and buy a car and then fix it up and then resell it, kind of flipping cars like you flip houses. And this particular video was about a Tesla he had found. He showed it to you, it was black, it was dirty, had all this writing all over on the windshield that the auctioneers had put there, and they put on there the word dead. Now, if it's dead, and of course it's not working, you can't get inside to look at the interior because the doors won't open. And in fact, once he bought it, they had to come Slim Jim in order to try to get inside. But that didn't work, and they had to use a forklift to pick it up and put it up on the truck because they couldn't roll it. But he bought it for $10,000, which to me sounds like a lot of money, but to him, he said, that was a really good deal. Well, he found out that once he got in there, that it really wasn't dead, it just needed to be charged. And if they had taken a little time to charge it, then the other people there to buy would have been able to get inside and would have been able to see the real value of it. He thought he could have been sold for $20,000 plus. But these auctioneers didn't want to be bothered with it. They didn't want to put the time in it. To them, it was not worth that much. But this guy bought it, and suddenly he sees the worth in it. So there are people out there who don't see the worth in Jesus. But do we? And do we show it? Are we more in the sacrifice mode, or are we more in the gain mode? Jesus asked earlier, what does it profit a man? What will he gain if he gets the whole world but loses his soul? And of course, when we look here, you've got the chief priests and the scribes, and you've got Judas. They're trying to gain the world. But Jesus is not concerned with that, and this woman isn't either. When we look at our possessions, are we trying to hold on to them? Are we trying to use them for bettering those around us or encouraging them? Are we trying to use it in order to benefit Jesus? What about our money? It's easy. We live in a society where we want to, of course, save up for retirement. We've got all kinds of things to do. And how we do that is going to be different, all of us. But what's our general attitude towards our money? Where does it come from? Who really owns it? And how should we use it? What about our time? All of us get 24 hours a day. Some of us need less sleep than others. Some of us need more. Some of us just, are clueless about how to use our time, but we still get 24 hours. Do we do things in there that demonstrate we know the worth of Jesus in our lives? Because sometimes that means sacrificing. And then ultimately, what about our life? Is our life so precious that we would hold on to it and lose what Jesus has to give to us? Or would we be willing to give it up? This woman gave up something really, really valuable in order to demonstrate her life. Demonstrate her belief and her devotion to Jesus. And the story around her is there are a bunch of people who couldn't care less about him. In fact, they want him dead. Only they don't realize that they're playing into God's hands. They don't realize that that's the plan. So Mark gives us this thing called a sandwich story. And when we bite into it, it gives us this whole picture about devotion to Jesus and what it means. Here is a woman whose devotion to Jesus now is told throughout the ages. And unfortunately, though, in the same breath, we tell about the chief priests and the scribes and Judas, but in the opposite end. Nothing but judgment. So as you're reading through the Gospels, you can see some other sandwich stories there. But this one asks us, what is Jesus worth in our lives and in the future? Well, do we know that he's got something more valuable than anything we hold on to? And are we willing to sacrifice it for him? That's always the question. This morning, there might be somebody here who's not given their life to Jesus just yet, who hasn't said, yes, he's the one that I know I need to give my life for. We give you an opportunity to come and to repent of your sins and then confess your faith in Jesus because he's the one who gave his life for you so that you might be set free from your bondage to sin. And then by faith to be baptized, immersed into his name, because there is where you connect to his blood. And if you're ready to do that today, we give you the opportunity. And I'm sure the brothers and sisters here are ready to help you. And if you, as a member of God's family, need prayers, well, Lompoc here is a church family. We love each other. We care about each other, don't we? And no matter where we go, we find family. And so if you need help from your family, now is the time to come and to let them know. So we give you the opportunity to come while we stand and sing.